The body was discovered just before sunrise, lying face down near the shoulder of a desolate highway outside Oklahoma City. Her head was severely injured. Blood had seeped into the gravel, forming an irregular pattern, trailing from her scalp to the road's edge. There were no skid marks, no vehicle fragments, and no sign of panic braking. The absence of physical evidence at the scene contradicted the assumption of an accidental hit-and-run. Emergency responders noted the victim's fingernails were broken and her hands scraped, consistent with attempts to crawl or resist movement post-impact. At the hospital, the attending physician observed multiple bruises at varying stages of healing across her body, especially on her back, upper arms, and thighs. These injuries were inconsistent with a single incident vehicular trauma. Within 48 hours, she briefly regained consciousness, but was disoriented and unable to speak. 5 days later, she died from internal brain hemorrhage. No family visited aside from one man, older, controlling, silent, who claimed to be her father. The decedent was identified as Sharon Marshall, aged approximately 20. No close relatives came forward. Friends from her workplace, a local strip club, described her as kind, intelligent, and secretive. They were stunned when hospital staff informed them visitation had been restricted by the same man claiming parental rights. He provided identification under the name Franklin Delano Floyd. Analyzing Floyd's pattern of behavior during this period reveals a profile consistent with coercive control and gradual domination. His insistence on limiting access to the victim post-injury indicates a high-risk concealment strategy, likely aimed at preventing disclosure. The ban on hospital visitors, combined with the suspicious timing of Sharon's sudden death despite apparent signs of recovery, points toward a deliberate effort to terminate a potential threat, not merely emotional, but legal. This form of behavior is not uncommon in offenders who maintain long-term psychological captivity over victims. The power structure is carefully maintained through isolation, fear, and the destruction of social ties. The moment Sharon began to regain autonomy, professionally, socially, or romantically, she became a liability. Her death removed the last remaining witness to years of fabricated identities and abusive control. Floyd's subsequent attempt to collect an $80,000 life insurance policy on Sharon, a policy taken out just months prior, further demonstrates premeditation. When initial efforts failed due to mismatched Social Security records, Floyd was forced to use his real name, exposing him to outstanding warrants and triggering a cascade of law enforcement inquiries. Crime scene analysts and behavioral experts observed that the setting of the supposed accident lacked basic forensic indicators of a vehicle strike. The trajectory of blood suggested a collapse rather than impact. The orientation of the body and the minimal spread of debris implied that she was already on the ground when the injury occurred. The theory of a staged accident became more plausible with each detail uncovered. The lack of defensive wounds on her face, but clear trauma to the back of her skull, supports the hypothesis of a blunt force assault, possibly while incapacitated. This tactical use of violence aligns with Floyd's known behavioral pattern: calculated, goal-driven, and designed to minimize exposure. Violence is only used when control fails. One question remains unanswered in this phase of analysis: why did Floyd wait until that moment to eliminate her, after years of apparent loyalty and dependence? What shift, psychological, emotional, or circumstantial, triggered the breakdown of his control mechanisms? The answer may lie in what Sharon was planning at the time of her death, and who she might have trusted with the truth. Sharon Marshall appeared, on the surface, to embody the ideal American teenager. Her academic record was exceptional, her demeanor consistently described as polite and ambitious, and her future seemed mapped toward scientific excellence. She was awarded a full scholarship to Georgia Tech, intending to pursue aerospace engineering. Those who interacted with her during this period recalled her as unusually mature, quietly driven, and resistant to typical adolescent distractions. None of them questioned the older man she referred to as her father, a man who rarely spoke but always lingered nearby. Franklin Delano Floyd, posing as her father, constructed a meticulously managed illusion. He presented himself as a supportive, if overprotective, parent. His ability to remain peripheral yet in control allowed him to maintain dominance without drawing suspicion. Over time, he systematically restricted Sharon's autonomy while feeding her a distorted version of normalcy. The illusion was not maintained through overt force, but through emotional dependency, strategic isolation, and manufactured loyalty. This form of psychological captivity is often more enduring than physical confinement. The victim, particularly when exposed to the perpetrator from a young age, begins to equate obedience with safety. Floyd reinforced this dynamic by offering conditional affection and sporadic freedoms, rewards that reinforced compliance and masked control. By the time Sharon became pregnant near the end of high school, the veneer of independence was already eroding. The identity she had built, student, scholar, future engineer, was quietly dismantled. She gave the child up for adoption, without informing the biological father, and abandoned her scholarship without explanation. This decision did not occur in isolation. It was the consequence of prolonged psychological conditioning that taught her silence was safer than resistance. After relocating to Tampa with Floyd, Sharon re-entered a new environment under a different name. Her surroundings changed, but the dynamic remained static. Her roles shifted, from student to mother, from daughter to partner, yet all within the confines of Floyd's control. She began working as an exotic dancer to provide financial stability. Floyd, unable to work consistently, depended on her income while continuing to exert authority over both Sharon and her child, Michael. Witness testimony indicates that Sharon was deeply conflicted. She showed warmth toward co-workers, built friendships, and expressed moments of hope. However, her actions suggested she was monitoring boundaries carefully. She avoided discussing her past and limited emotional disclosure. These are indicators of someone accustomed to guarding information as a survival strategy. Floyd's control extended to regulating who Sharon could interact with, where she could go, and how she spoke about herself. The introduction of a second pregnancy, this time with a child she chose to keep, triggered a shift in Floyd's behavior. The presence of Michael disrupted the dyad he had maintained with Sharon. As Sharon formed emotional bonds outside his control, Floyd's internal stability weakened. This pattern often precedes acts of desperation in long-term coercive offenders. One key escalation occurred in the form of conflict between Floyd and Cheryl Camesso, a friend and co-worker of Sharon. Witnesses reported open hostility, including threats and physical aggression. Shortly thereafter, Cheryl disappeared. Her remains would not be found until years later. This disappearance marked a turning point, suggesting that Floyd, previously adept at covert manipulation, was now crossing into overt elimination of perceived threats. By this stage, Floyd's operational model had shifted. What began as long-term grooming had evolved into reactive violence. The facade was breaking. Sharon was no longer fully compliant. Michael represented a breach in dependency, and outside relationships threatened exposure. Floyd's response was consistent with offenders who rely on secrecy to survive. When secrecy is endangered, they remove the source of threat. The question remains whether Sharon, during this period, was actively planning an escape or simply expressing passive resistance. Understanding this distinction is critical in assessing Floyd's next move, and whether he acted out of fear of loss or simply because the illusion he built was beginning to crack. The disappearance of Cheryl Camesso occurred during a critical destabilization period in Franklin Delano Floyd's control structure. The relational dynamic he had enforced upon Sharon Marshall was beginning to erode, not from direct confrontation, but through the accumulation of external interactions beyond his reach. Cheryl, a young co-worker who had formed a visible friendship with Sharon, became a focal point of conflict, not because of any specific action, but because of what she represented: autonomy, influence, and the potential for outside scrutiny. Witnesses described several verbal altercations between Floyd and Cheryl in the weeks preceding her disappearance. On at least one occasion, Floyd physically assaulted her in public view. His reaction to her criticism of Sharon's financial secrecy and use of government benefits indicated an increased sensitivity to perceived challenges. This pattern aligns with offenders who maintain dominance through threat suppression. Any voice that encourages the victim's independence becomes a liability. Shortly after one of these incidents, Cheryl vanished. Her last known location was en route to visit a friend. She never arrived. Her vehicle was later found abandoned near an airport, but no flight records or activity linked her to departure. Law enforcement inquiries at the time failed to establish probable cause against Floyd or Sharon, largely due to the absence of physical evidence and the transient nature of their identities. Following Cheryl's disappearance, Sharon's behavior became notably subdued. Colleagues recalled that she withdrew socially and became less communicative, often appearing anxious or distracted. This behavioral shift is consistent with trauma-induced hypervigilance, a psychological state in which victims anticipate further violence and adapt through silence. In coercive control environments, this is not merely emotional withdrawal, it is a survival mechanism. Sharon's death, presented publicly as a hit-and-run, removed the final variable Floyd could not fully suppress: the lack of vehicular evidence at the scene, combined with the pre-existing bruises on her body, supports the hypothesis of a staged accident. Autopsy findings noted that certain injuries did not match standard impact trauma, raising further suspicion. The fact that Sharon was showing signs of improvement in the hospital before deteriorating rapidly after Floyd restricted visitor access remains a critical point of forensic ambiguity. Soon after her death, Floyd attempted to collect life insurance, providing false information multiple times before reluctantly revealing his legal identity. This act triggered a broader investigation, uncovering his fugitive status and criminal history. At this stage, Floyd abandoned his fabricated role as father and instead claimed to be Michael's biological parent. This marked a strategic shift, from concealment to reclamation, suggesting that Floyd viewed Michael not as a child, but as an asset tied to his previous source of control. The abduction of Michael from his elementary school was methodical. Floyd used a firearm to coerce the principal into compliance, then tied him to a tree and fled with the child. His escape route was calculated and deliberate, involving the theft of a vehicle and movement across state lines. He remained at large for nearly 2 months before being apprehended, during which time Michael disappeared permanently. Floyd's refusal to provide information regarding the child's fate, even under legal pressure, is indicative of a final act of domination. In his psychological framework, withholding the truth maintained leverage, not just over investigators, but over the narrative itself. This stage of the case presents a full behavioral evolution, from manipulation to violence, from concealment to destruction. Floyd no longer relied on silence alone. He acted preemptively, eliminating threats and controlling outcomes. What remains uncertain is whether his final acts were motivated by desperation, ideological collapse, or the simple recognition that his carefully maintained illusion was beyond repair. One remaining question persists. At what point did Sharon transition from passive compliance to latent resistance? And did she ever truly believe escape was possible? The true identity of Sharon Marshall remained unknown for over 2 decades. Only in 2010, through advanced forensic methods and collaborative case re-examination, was it confirmed that she had been born Suzanne Marie Sevakis, a child abducted in the 1970s by Franklin Delano Floyd, under an assumed identity. The implications of this discovery retroactively reframed every known action of the offender, aligning previously disconnected events into a single, coherent trajectory of escalating criminal control. In the mid-1970s, Floyd had entered a relationship with a woman named Sandra Chipman, a recently divorced mother of 4. During her brief incarceration on a minor charge, Floyd, operating under the alias Brandon Williams, took all 4 children without legal consent. 2 were later found in state custody. 1, a boy, had been placed for adoption. The eldest, Suzanne, disappeared entirely from official records until she resurfaced years later under the fabricated identity of Sharon Marshall. Floyd's selection of Suzanne as the sole child to keep suggests deliberate targeting, potentially based on psychological or emotional factors. Offenders with coercive tendencies often isolate one victim who exhibits traits that can be molded into long-term dependency. By controlling her environment, movement, and identity from early childhood, Floyd effectively erased Suzanne's original self and replaced it with a version of his own design. During this period, Floyd shifted locations frequently, exploiting inconsistencies in state-level record-keeping to avoid detection. He falsified school documents, medical records, and Social Security information. These actions were not random. They formed a sustained operational pattern aimed at constructing an alternate reality. Suzanne was entered into school systems under different names, each time reinforcing her detachment from any previous identity. This long-term deception created a scenario in which the victim no longer had any point of reference outside of the offender's narrative. Later, forensic examination of the photographs found in a vehicle once driven by Floyd confirmed another layer of this deception. Several images, recovered alongside those of Cheryl Camesso, depicted a much younger Suzanne, visibly distressed and in compromising situations. These images, combined with timeline analysis, suggest Floyd had begun exploiting her sexually while she was still a minor, well before she was presented publicly as his partner or wife. This kind of dual-role manipulation, alternating between caregiver and abuser, is a hallmark of long-term psychological captivity. Victims are conditioned to internalize confusion, guilt, and loyalty, even under extreme duress. Floyd's ability to maintain this dynamic for years without external intervention demonstrates both his manipulative skill and the systemic vulnerabilities he exploited. Additional records uncovered during this phase of the investigation revealed that Floyd had a history of prior offenses involving abduction and sexual assault, dating back to the 1960s. His criminal timeline shows recurring patterns, identifying isolated or vulnerable targets, eliminating witnesses, and constructing false identities to navigate between jurisdictions. Each step in his behavioral evolution reinforces the conclusion that control, not only over individuals, but over narrative, identity, and consequence, was his primary objective. Suzanne's transformation into Sharon Marshall was not merely an act of name alteration. It was a full erasure of origin, family, and autonomy. The manipulation began as a logistical decision, but evolved into a psychological regime, one sustained by fear, coercion, and dependency. Every decision Floyd made, from moving between states to registering her for school, served to further that regime. What remains unresolved is how many other victims, potential or actual, crossed paths with Floyd during the decades he remained unaccounted for. The case raises a broader concern. How many fabricated identities mask ongoing victimization, hidden behind legal documents that tell only part of the story? Franklin Delano Floyd constructed a system of psychological, logistical, and emotional captivity that functioned independently of physical barriers. This system operated through false identities, coerced dependence, geographic dislocation, and control over access to legal educational, and social systems. The structure he created was not a spontaneous result of impulse or mental instability, but the product of sustained, intentional design. At its core, Floyd's method relied on three interconnected mechanisms: isolation, control of identity, and manipulation of perception. Each served to eliminate external checks on his authority. By severing victims from familial, institutional, and social frameworks, he ensured that no outside force could intervene. He weaponized bureaucracy, exploiting gaps between agencies and jurisdictions, allowing him to move freely while remaining untraceable. The manipulation of identity, both his own and that of his victims, served not only as a means of avoiding detection, but also as a tool for psychological domination. Naming is a foundational element of personhood. By renaming his primary victim and dictating her history, appearance, and future, he dismantled her ability to define herself. This erasure made resistance not just unlikely, but conceptually inaccessible. Victims within such systems often display behaviors misinterpreted by outsiders as complicity or passivity. In reality, they are operating under an internalized threat model, conditioned to assess every interaction for potential consequences. The absence of overt resistance from Suzanne, known publicly as Sharon, cannot be measured by typical standards of agency. Her compliance was not consent, it was survival. Floyd's ability to avoid consequences for decades demonstrates a calculated understanding of systemic failure. He did not require weapons or accomplices. He required only time, distance, and silence. The fact that his actions spanned multiple states, legal systems, and institutions without sustained intervention highlights vulnerabilities in interagency communication and identity verification procedures, particularly involving children in non-traditional custody arrangements. When Floyd was finally sentenced to death for the murder of Cheryl Camesso and given decades in prison for the kidnapping of Michael Hughes, the legal system responded with finality. Yet the full impact of his crimes cannot be measured solely by convictions. The damage extended far beyond physical harm. It rewrote lives, erased identities, and exploited the fundamental trust embedded in societal systems meant to protect the vulnerable. The psychological profile of Floyd reflects a high-functioning antisocial personality with narcissistic traits and an exceptional capacity for manipulative behavior. His actions were not driven by impulse or delusion, but by a sustained need for dominance, reinforced through deception and exploitation. He did not isolate his victims through physical restraint, but by constructing a false reality and placing himself at its center. Cases like this force a reassessment of what constitutes imprisonment. Floyd never needed bars or handcuffs. His victims were confined by documentation, by lies, and by the absence of anyone who knew enough or dared enough to intervene. The prison was not physical, it was conceptual, and it was built, maintained, and controlled entirely by one man. In closing, this case illustrates the complexity and reach of coercive control when executed by a skilled manipulator. It challenges conventional models of victimhood, raises critical questions about institutional accountability, and underscores the necessity for systemic reform in identity tracking and child protection protocols. Sharon Marshall's story, once obscured by falsified records and silence, now stands as a documented example of how psychological captivity can be more enduring and more damaging than any locked cell.